I guess I'm saying hi, everybody. All right,
Yep.
so hi, everybody. Usually Erin says hello to everyone, and we're glad to have this chance to be with you. And we know that one of the issues that's been keeping a lot of people up at night is how to handle some of the choices and some of the difficult choices that you have to make. How to comply with state law, what's available through furloughs, how to handle layoffs, so many things that have been bubbling. So we thought the best way to help you is to bring an expert in who can answer your questions and share with you what he's seeing and what he would recommend. So it's my pleasure to introduce Clark, a good friend of CNM. And also to let you know that if you put your questions in the chat room, he will do his best to answer them. Erin does a really good job of keeping an eye, and we'll make sure that we get you the answers that you need today as best we can. So with that, my pleasure to turn it over to Clark. And as many of you may know, he runs a firm called Expert Effect. And our favorite expert, Clark, take it away.
Great, thanks Regina. And thanks to Center for Nonprofit Management. You've just really stepped it up on just being an incredible resource to the nonprofit community. You always know how to pivot in different seasons of what the nonprofit industry goes through. And this is a unique one. I've been in the human resources field since 1995. And when I got into the field, I knew it was a challenging field. But never expected to go through something like this. It was actually interesting when I was at Anschutz Entertainment Group, which is a large entertainment company with entertainment venues around the world. When I was their director of human resources, a good 15 years ago, my boss walked into my office and he said, "I just got a call from the owner of the company, and he's concerned about the avian flu. So he has asked us to put together a contingency plan. And it needs to be like at least 100 pages to cover all the details. And he wants it within a week because he's really concerned about this." And we were all just scratching our heads like, what? Avian flu? It's like in another country. And we worked so hard and got a consulting company involved. And put so much work into it, and then really collected dust because nothing happened with the avian flu. And it's just so interesting that fast forward, that owner was so progressive, thinking like something like this actually could happen, and it has. So I'm sure AEG actually dusted off that plan, and our hours of work of creating it paid off. So yeah, it is an interesting time. I'm really glad to be here with all of you. I am going to do my best to answer your questions. Usually I'm pretty good at answering HR questions since I've been doing it for so long, but there's so much ambiguity and so much changing at such a fast pace, and we don't have case law yet. So I'm not going to be able to answer every question. I'll just be upfront about that. We will give my email address at the end. So if there's a question I can't answer and one of you wants me and my team at Expert Effect, we have a group of HR experts. We could do a little research for you and get back to you and give you a thoughtful answer. I'd be happy to do that. And then there might be some questions that arise that are going to be best answered by an employment attorney. So CNM does have a great resource for that. Erin, I believe there's a webinar tomorrow. Is that correct?
Yes. So tomorrow on our weekly Friday Lunch and Learns from 11:30 to 12:30, we're going to be joined by a couple of legal experts talking mostly about what to think about if you're starting to think about closing your organization. And so they'll be able to answer a lot of employment law questions, and I will post that information in the chat shortly.
Great. So join tomorrow. There might be a few questions that come up, and I'm just going to say punt. And that means punt to the employment attorneys. And the resource desk at CNM can get you in touch with those employment attorneys if you do want to engage with them. Just because they're in the courts every day and have a whole team of legal experts looking at things. There's a lot of things I will be able to answer, but just some that are going to be best coming from them. So yes, Regina mentioned some of the things that have come up. Thank you everyone for submitting questions. We got a whole bunch of questions, and it does run the gamut from furloughs to employee safety. It is kind of encouraging that the government is thinking about returning to work, and companies are starting to think like, hey, well, what are we going to do? So it's nice that we're past that stage of when is this ever going to end to like, how do we have a good reentry? So we will be able to go into as many of these as we can. So Aaron, I will look to you. What should be the first question that we can tackle?
Yeah, before we dive in, thank you for starting to submit your questions. Please use the Q&A widget if you can. That'll be the best for us to be able to track and make sure everything's been answered. But there were a couple of great themes that emerged from all the questions that you submitted that I think maybe we can get started and you can talk kind of on a high level too. As you alluded, I think getting back to work in person and sort of all of the surrounding questions that go into that were some of the top questions about, you know, what rules do you set? What options do you give employees? And what kind of feedback do you ask for? And how do you communicate it? And just like, how do you even go about creating that plan?
Yes. I'm going to steal an analogy that I heard from somebody, and I just thought it was so spot on. When a band is getting ready to do a concert, they come up with a playlist. And a really good band like U2 knows how to put together the perfect playlist. And so companies right now are starting to put together a playlist. Like, how do we want this to go when we return? And if companies don't give a lot of thought to the playlist, they're not going to have a good reentry. So now is the time to really be thinking through and being thoughtful for how do we do this reentry. So, you know, first and foremost is how do we make our employees feel safe? There's a broad range of how people feel at this time. I got intel that Carpinteria this past weekend, there was a beach that was open to the public, and that beach was just a swarm of people. Like, just, it looked busier than July 4th. Whereas you have certain neighborhoods in LA where if someone's not wearing a mask, people are like, oh my gosh, how could you not be wearing a mask? So you're going to get this huge gamut of where employees feel, and maybe based on their health scenario or people, you know, if they have a loved one who's elderly, they're going to have differing opinions of what is safe. So one of the biggest things is just figuring out what that looks like. So there's just one thing that I would recommend is doing a survey in advance, an online survey where you kind of gauge employees like, how ready are you to return to work on a scale of 1 to 10? 2 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now. If we returned, do you have any recommendations of what we could do to make you feel safe? And would you be open to a different schedule so that we don't have, you know, let's have half the staff in at a time? And so really kind of getting a pulse for people in the organization, and you could have an outside party do that survey so it's all anonymous, and get a gauge for how employees are thinking about returning to work. And then there are some things where there's legal things where some companies are saying, hey, let's, you know, we need to make sure that we're not exposing the people we serve to this. So like if your nonprofit serves a vulnerable population, how can you make sure that your employees are safe? So there is some new things. The EEOC just published some guidelines. So if you go to their website, there's some guidelines on testing that employers can do. So employers can require, so they're saying that they can require that someone takes a test to see if they have COVID-19. That's kind of hard to do because testing is not really readily available yet. Maybe it will be in 2 to 4 weeks, but there might be some nonprofits that are like, just like you do criminal background checks through the FBI and DOJ and do the live scans, you might say like, hey, for our frontline people who are interacting with the people we serve, you do need to get tested. And does that mean the employee gets tested on their own and you reimburse? The EEOC hasn't been really clear yet. And then, hey, if you get tested, what if the person gets the virus the very next day? So a way to combat that, and the EOC is saying it's okay, is to take temperatures, where a company could once a day or twice a day take temperatures. And that could be a requirement, but there's some legality issues around there. And there is a posting that needs to go out into the workplace if there is going to be temperature testing that the EOC has published. So that's just one aspect of the returning to work. We could probably spend this whole time talking about returning to work, but I'll just throw that out there as a starter.
I think that taking a survey is a really interesting idea of just gauging employees, just where they're feeling, as well as, you know, getting a sense of what are the requirements that are available. You mentioned some of the legal considerations about asking or mandating people to return to work. Regina mentioned a good one too of, you know, it's looking like businesses are going to be returning before schools reopen. And curious what some of those specific considerations are for working parents who may still be watching kids at home as you're planning that process.
Yeah. So under the Families First Act, which applies to any organizations under 500 employees, an employee can get up to 12 weeks of time off if they are unable to work either on a full-time basis or on an intermittent basis because they are caring for a child, either a child that's in daycare or if they're kind of doing the homeschool route. So a lot of parents are juggling both. Some parents I know are just like, hey, if my kid misses out on really good education for a month and a half, that's okay for my sanity. I'm not going to do all the assignments assigned because I just can't do both. And I think that's a really good philosophy. I've heard a lot of educators say, parents, you know, the relationship health of your family is more important than your kid falling behind by a month and a half. But with that said, if an employee does come to you at your organization or you yourself are in this position, you do get up to 12 weeks off for that. And it is partially paid, but employers can get a tax credit on the payments they make for that. Now, with that said, there is an exemption for small businesses. So if a small business says, hey, this is going to put us under, we have so many people that are wanting to take the sick leave or this one position, if they're not, you know, by us doing this, it's going to really impact us as an organization, then you could request an exemption. And Families First Act hasn't really said how you apply for that or how that plays out. They just say kind of get your ducks in a row of how you could prove that. So there is an out for an employer if it's a really undue hardship. But I haven't run across any employers that have had that case yet. So they are having to find a way to give that employee the time off and to compensate them.
Gotcha. Cindy had a follow-up question about taking temperatures in the workplace. They were told that taking temps is a little questionable because you're in effect giving a medical exam and are then subject to HIPAA. Any idea what to consider if you're thinking about a temperature taking policy?
Yes. Yeah. So typically, like pre this pandemic, I would just be like, what? You want to take an employee's temperature? Don't even go there. But now the EOC is saying, you know, that is okay. But they do have to make sure that the tests are accurate and reliable. They need to consider that there might be false positives or false negatives. And it's kind of like when you take your kid's temperature and it's 104 and you freak out and you're ready to take them to the emergency room, and 5 minutes later you take it and you're like, oh my gosh, the temperature thing was off. Or my kid sat on it and that's why it was so hot. So you know, we have to take those things into mind. And so, yeah, it is okay to do, but there's just there needs to be a huge protocol in place of, you know, the test results. Yes, those should be kept under lock and key. If someone tests positive, a reminder that we are not allowed to broadcast that they have COVID-19 or that they might. That is protected health information. So if someone tests positive, we really need to keep it hush hush. And it reminds me of, I love the show Homeland, and in one of the episodes, a Russian spy is found out. And so the American diplomat comes and it's like, hush, hush, we're going to get you out of here before the Russians come and get you. And it's kind of same thing, like, oh my gosh, you have a high temperature, but it's not broadcasting to the office. So-and-so went home because of a high temperature, because then that could be violating the law that we revealed they had COVID-19. So we would want to have to say, you know, get HR involved, the supervisor involved. What's the protocol? We send them home. They see a doctor, or they consult with the doctor over the phone. We might let the workplace know that, you know, someone has tested positive for COVID-19, but we can't reveal their identity because it's personal health information.
Gotcha. It's complicated.
Very.
A couple of questions about the Families First exemptions that we were talking about. An anonymous attendee asked, saying that they worked at a homeless services nonprofit. One of the services they provide is medical services. Does the Families First CARES Act exempt those employees that perform medical services only, and everyone else can use it? How does, yeah.
That is one I'd want to do some further research on, because it's applying only to a certain industry, and there could be some carve-outs that are kind of buried deep in the FAQs. So if you like, should I give out my email address now so that person could email me individually?
We'll do it in the follow-up. We'll send around
Perfect.
a recording with everything and make sure that they've got your contact info, so anyone with deeper dive questions can follow up. Another exemption question about employees with children out of school. If the organization provides telecommuting arrangements with, you know, schedule flexibility, can employees still exempt out, or is the organization sort of meeting flexible requirements?
Yes, that's a tricky one. I think it's really good for organizations to be flexible, because that is a way for, you know, them to keep the productivity of that employee, and the employee might very well prefer to keep working and staying engaged, even though they are taking care of a child. So I think exploring that first is great, but it's really up to the employee to certify that whether or not they can work. So if an employee says, I need time off to care for my child, even on an intermittent basis, they complete something, and, you know, in there, the employer can say, hey, we're offering this, you know, document that to the employee. This is our offer to you. We've had some dialogue. This is a flexible arrangement. The employee comes back and says, even with that flexible arrangement, that I still can't do it. It's them certifying. And so if they've certified under penalty of perjury that they can't, the employer kind of has to take their word on it, and they would be eligible for the leave. Gotcha. But the government, this form that you can get off of the Department of Labor website, and it's the best form. It's a good one as backup that you can use to get the tax credits as you pay employees for sick leave or whatnot under Families First. It makes it really clear, like, it's not a good idea for an employee to lie on that form. So they've made that loud and clear that employees have to be truthful, or there could be major consequences.
Gotcha. So we're getting a few more Families First exemption questions. So I'm just going to roll with this topic for a little bit. So somebody asked here that one of the Families First flyers says that a part-time employee is eligible for leave for the number of hours that the employee is normally scheduled to work over that period. As these part-time employees may have had their hours reduced over COVID, which number of hours are you working against? Their normal previous schedule or the new reduced schedule?
Yes, this is one where you do want to get a HR person involved. So if you have an HR person at your organization, or get an HR consultant involved, because the government's kind of laid out some particular formulas you can use to determine the average hours. And you don't want to calculate it incorrectly, because we are predicting that people in this economy, if the economy does have a really hard time recovering, people could get desperate for money. And so plaintiff attorneys are going to be putting a lot of feelers out. And something like this, if we underpaid an employee because we calculated their hours incorrectly, that could be a claim that we violated the Families First Act by not paying them incorrectly, even though we tried our best. So it's really good to get an HR person, payroll person, or a consultant involved to really help kind of be a check and balance to make sure that's an accurate number.
Yeah. Another exemption, quite well similar, but what's the best way to allow exempt employees to take advantage of intermittent emergency paid sick leave and record the 2/3 pay?
All right, so there you're looking at, typically I would think it would be pretty simple where you would just take their annualized salary and look at, 2/3 of that pay if they were going to be just completely off work. But it does get tricky when we're looking at intermittent, right? So there, I think, you could assume a 40-hour work week, or if there's something in writing that says that exempt employees typically average this amount, then you could go with that average. And then you work into, okay, you're getting this much less, and really, I guess you could base it on the salary. If the salary is reducing by this percentage, that's the number of hours per day. So there'd be some, again, these like tricky calculations to figure out what makes sense for that exempt employee. So again, getting an expert involved, someone who really can crunch the numbers for you. And then just a side note on exempt salaries, if an exempt employee is working reduced hours, and they're getting paid less, then if they fall below the salary threshold, which is 2 times the minimum wage, we do need to convert them to hourly. And then that calculation can be more simple as an hourly employee. But that's one where companies aren't realizing like, wow, they're dropping below because they're getting a lower rate.
Gotcha.
Hey, Aaron, I'm gonna, one of the questions that came up sort of relates to that idea, Clark, that as people are trying to figure out how to cover operating expenses, are we allowed to shift from full-time salaried employees to part-time hourly or part salaried in order to make this all work in the next few months, given that the math is so unpredictable? Is there flexibility there? Is that allowed?
Yeah, great question. Typically in California, employees are at will. It of course helps if you had an employee handbook that had a lot of at-will language, if you gave an offer letter to the employees that had at-will language, and that just shows that their employment is at will. So the nature of their employment can change at any time based on any reason. And this is a significant reason of, a nonprofit having reduced funding, having reduced donations, where they do need to make some hard decisions to keep the nonprofit viable. So yes, definitely that is within bounds to reduce the hours that employees are working, change their classification if need be, all of the above. The one caveat is to really look at, are you doing it in a way that has a really good business justification, that is fair, and that doesn't create disparate impact. So there's a lot there. And so this is, again, where there'll probably be a lot of litigation where a company is just like, hey, we're trying to do the best we can to figure out whose hours are going to get reduced. But I'd say actually put something in writing, maybe something to your board that says this is our business justification for reducing these employees' hours. We have to keep these employees' hours at full time because of the nature of their position. And if we reduce their hours, it would hurt us even more over the long term. But a document that really spells out, that way if one employee cries foul and says, hey, the way you reduced hours, it impacted this ethnicity group negatively. My hours got reduced and you knew that I had a disability. Or my hours got reduced and I'm the only person in this organization that is this religion, and it had to be because of my religion. So if an employee claims something along those lines, then you'd have a document to fall back on. There was a confidential document, but that you could produce and say, hey, look, we gave a lot of thought to this. We documented. There was a business justification for doing it this way. We did it in a very fair manner. And there was a rhyme or reason to this. It had nothing to do with discrimination or retaliation.
That sounds like a great rule of thumb. And we had a lot of questions in the form that related to just kind of different options about scaling back. Some that we had just talked about of reducing hours, switching employees to part-time, furloughs or layoffs. And some of the questions too related to kind of the impact of some of those decisions on the organization, like how might it affect government funding, like PPP that you're getting, or on the employee side of like, when do they get to keep their medical insurance? When do we allow them to collect unemployment? And there's kind of this push and pull there. So curious if you could talk a little bit about, you know, the decision to scale back and some of the various levers that people have to pull, and what are some of those considerations?
Yes. So if you have applied for the small business funding, it is really good to look at the particulars for the type of funding that you applied for and make sure that you know the stipulations that are attached. Also, there's the EDD work share program, which is another way to ease the burden for employers. But again, there's stipulations attached to that. So you don't want to go outside those bounds. So double checking, and the bank that you applied through, for the loan should be able to give you those particulars if you don't already have them in writing. And then unemployment. I mean, this is thankfully a time when employees can get more unemployment than they regularly can. So that is nice that employees, could potentially get more money than they're making as an employee, or not have reduced wages, whereas historically it was always about 60% of someone's salary. So that's a pretty huge impact. So I'm finding that employees aren't they get it if they need to be laid off, and they can get unemployment, and it's not going to really affect them financially, but they know that they might be able to come back. It's a temporary furlough. That just feels that they understand that, and they know that could help them keep a job long term rather than the organization going under. So I think employees are very open to the unemployment concept, whereas historically maybe they weren't. And then other implications. Anything else on that question? It was kind of a multi-part question. Did I miss anything there?
I think one piece was employee benefits. When are you still providing benefits and when are you not?
Yes. So it's really interesting. The Department of Labor issued some memorandums multiple years back saying that a temporary furlough can't be more than a pay period. But most companies I'm talking to are not following that, because if you actually have to terminate the employee, you have to pay out PTO or vacation. The employee goes on COBRA, and all of that is very disruptive. So I've talked to some employment attorneys about this, and they likened it to 9/11, where companies, made some decisions that were outside the bounds of kind of what the law had said under normal circumstances, but they felt it was advantageous to the employee, and they did not suffer any consequences for that. So in this situation, when you think about it, like, okay, should I keep this employee on furlough because we're maybe near the end of this, or do I have to terminate their employment? Oftentimes keeping the employee on furlough is going to be to their benefit. Number one, it gives them some job security, like, oh, okay, it's temporary. I'm not, out the door. Also, they can maybe stay on the health plan, which is nice. So they have that continuity. They don't have to pay the COBRA. And so there's a lot of upsides where it's probably okay to do. You have to kind of weigh the risk and kind of make sure that the employee would agree that, hey, this is advantageous for them. And then it is good to check with your benefit broker, because oftentimes there's stipulations that if an employee is inactive for a certain amount of time, they have to go off the health plan or have to go off life insurance or disability. But a lot of carriers have extended that during this crisis situation. So if you check with your benefits broker, they can check with the carrier and see exactly when you need to take the employee off. But it's very likely you could keep them on under these circumstances.
We had a few specific questions popping up while we were talking about scaling back salaries and hours and things. Annette asked that they're considering salary reductions for their staff, where the amount of the reduction would be tied to how much the employee makes. So the more they make, the larger the reduction. Curious if any comments on that policy. Does that seem like a decent way of going about doing that?
Yeah, we actually just added a diversity, equity, inclusion expert to our team. So we have the HR experts, but we've kind of added all sorts of experts during this time, outplacement experts, The diversity, inclusion, equity expert, we had a conversation on this. And when you look at furloughs, reduced schedules, and layoffs, oftentimes there does seem to be an inequity that those with privilege seem to not be affected as much during this time. So, you know, people at the top of the organization and whatnot. And so is there any legal issues there? Maybe not. But could it cause a rift in the organization? Could it cause some morale, some animosity? So I think it is a really good thing to think through. And what this organization is thinking of doing, I really think from an equity perspective, that makes a lot of sense because it's kind of equaling the playing field regardless of someone's salary. That those with a higher salary, they're going to feel the intensity at the same amount that someone with a lower salary would have. So it kind of bridges that, and it could just help from a cultural morale issue.
Yeah. There was an anonymous question asked here about employees who have been impacted, have their salaries reduced, but are still required to work the same amount of hours as before. What rights do employees have in situations like that?
Yes, unfortunately, because of the at-will nature, really it's one of those things where an organization can make that decision as long as they do it in a non-discriminatory way. It is fine. The employee could say, no, I cannot accept that pay rate for doing the same amount of work. The employee that would be within their right, and they could resign. And in that circumstance, they probably would be eligible for unemployment. Because if something changes about someone's job, usually if someone just resigns, they can't get unemployment, they're not eligible. But if the circumstances change, there usually is eligibility. So then they could tap into unemployment in that case.
Gotcha. Regina,
I was going to ask a question. Clark, pretty much throughout the COVID and economic downturn, what we've heard from a lot of leaders is how quickly they had to figure out strategies for managing their people remotely when they couldn't see them. And some have probably, it sounds like some have figured it out, some are feeling good about it, and some I know are still struggling. But one of these questions is about discipline and resolving conflicts. If you have any thoughts on best practice to resolve conflicts, misunderstandings, when you can't have in-person meetings, and in this case, they have a progressive discipline policy. So how to have some of those harder conversations and I guess document what you've talked about. So much is adjusting right now. I'm just curious what you're seeing that works.
Yes, this is such a balancing act. Because on the one end, some employees could see this as an opportunity to really slack off. Like, wow, this is great. I can do marathons on shows. I can, sleep in. And there's this is a joyous thing. It kind of reminds me of the snow days I had in Colorado. We'd watch the TV and it's like snow day, we can party. So some employees are feeling that way. That's not fair to the rest of the organization and the rest of the employees that are working hard. So that needs to be addressed. But then you do have other employees that are in a really tricky situation where they are trying to juggle the 40-hour full-time job. And then all of a sudden, they are taking care of their kids. I know a friend who also has the grandparents there and the sister there. And so it's also this thing where there's employees where they are doing their best, but they're only showing up at 60 or 70%, and there's nothing they can do about it. And they are feeling awful about it. They really are. So I'd say it really comes down to the supervisor, because I think if an organization just tries to approach it from a macro level and says, we are going to discipline employees that don't perform well, or this is our protocol, every situation is so unique. So I think it comes down to that supervisor and that employee. and the supervisor, like no time ever before, that they have an amazing link with that employee, that they over communicate, that they have a pulse on what's going on, that they check in with the employee. How are you doing? What's getting in the way? That they find ways to motivate the employee. And that if they do find that the employee is not pulling their weight, bringing that up to them, just as through a mature conversation of like, this is what I'm seeing, and this is how it's impacting our department and or the people we serve, and what can we do about it? So kind of a wake-up call. Just like a kid maybe going through summer school, their parent would say, like, hey, you got to do well at summer school, got to do well during this pandemic. I think we do have to be hesitant to do a lot of discipline and whatnot, because people are incredibly stressed out. Even if maybe they're not being conscientious, there's just a lot of anxiety. So I think, not being careful not to discipline during this time, because I think employers that really fall heavy on that, it could come back to bite them. And so, but still holding that accountability. And then, where conflict pops up, I think, just really, just kind of reminding employees, like, let's communicate. If you have a concern about someone, now is the time to give them a call, get on a Zoom, one-on-one. And I think probably what a lot of people are doing now is they're dealing with their conflict passive aggressively, through Slack, through Asana, through email, through text, or they're trying to resolve it over email, and that's not going to go well. So rather than walking down the hall like we used to and just going into someone's office and say, man, that really threw me for a curveball, what you did, we're trying to do it that way. So I think resolving the conflict and saying, hey, let's get on a Zoom together. Let's get our supervisor involved. Let's get HR involved. This is getting tense, and working through it in a verbal back and forth reaction rather than a virtual is the best route.
Yeah, I've noticed it's very difficult to read emotional intent when you're reading a Slack message or an email, and it breeds a lot of room for misunderstanding in that sense. That question definitely touched on one of the other buckets of questions that we got about, continuing to figure out and navigate remote working, specifically around like organizational liability and what you were touching on before about kind of the equity of resources. What employees do and don't have laptops or secure home Wi-Fi, or even just a place to be and work at home. I'm curious if you can speak just a little in general to the equity approach and any organizational like liability concerns in remote working situations.
Yes. So, there's, if you have a workforce and normally you have 10% working remotely, you're going to handle that a certain way. There's going to be, ergonomic considerations and technology considerations and such. But when all of a sudden that goes to 100% potentially, it could be very costly to do remote work the way you do. So I think, organizations just have to realize they're not going to perfect it during this time. And with the resources they have, figuring out, what's ideal. And just really, knowing that we're not going to be able to grant every employee's request when it comes to technology and equipment, but really seeing if there's an employee that's so frustrated by it, that, that employee, that their supervisor is checking in, and if the frustration level meets a certain point, that the company can do something about it. So it's kind of like triage, like, okay, what employees are having the most difficulty and how can we help them get back on track? And then liability wise, really important to have a remote work agreement in place. So if you don't have one now, it's good to have a policy or an actual agreement that employees would sign off on. And the HR department or HR consultant could provide a really good remote work agreement. And then keeping track of all the equipment that's being given out. So making sure that you keep track of that. And, if, hopefully later in May, we can return to work, someone keeping track of that people are actually returning all the stuff that was given to them. Because that could be costly to organizations if they don't have a close eye on that. And then just making sure that appropriate expenses are getting reimbursed. Because in California, we do need to reimburse employees if they're using their own equipment, or, you know, if they're having to go to the FedEx place to FedEx something, you know, reimbursing them for mileage. So there's all those considerations as well, so that we're honoring any of those commitments under the law.
What about any type of insurance? Sheree asked, what type of insurance do we need to have in place for online learning to protect my employees?
Yeah, so this is a great time to check in with your insurance broker and to say, hey, now that we're in this environment, you know, how are we? And that's actually a good thing to do all the time. I remember one of our clients, because we provide an outsourced HR solution, so we kind of serve as an HR department. And we came into an organization and to kind of run point on their HR. And the week after we were there, an employee got injured, and they realized they didn't have a workers' comp policy. So that was an awful thing for them to navigate. So it is good to just kind of check in with the insurance broker and say, hey, we want to make sure that we have all the right coverages. Is there any types of policies that we don't have now that we should consider? And do we need to change any of the deductibles under new economic conditions? Is there any way we can get some premium reductions during our next renewal? Now is a great time to tap into your broker and really lean in on them to help you make sure that all your insurance policies are in place and you have the best ones.
Yeah. One of the things you were talking about just now with the remote work policy and, you know, going from maybe 10% to 100% had me thinking about the first category of questions that we were talking about of getting back to normal. And right now things are a bit simpler because, you know, most places are probably some, you know, high percentage, 85 to 100% of, you know, remote working. But there's going to be a transition back, I'd imagine, where there's a period where some people are comfortable and allowed to return to work and other people are still remote working. And everything's going to be really confusing because it'll be more like 50-50. Curious, just going back to the how do you plan for the return to work, thinking about that with, you know, some percentage of people staying remote and suddenly you're managing, you know, some people in person and some people remotely.
Yes. So there, I think really getting the management team involved would be good. And really just talking through the dynamics of that organization. Every organization is different. And so I think rather than, you know, just maybe one or two people making a decision on this is how we're going to handle our reentry, kind of having a think tank, you know, like, hey, entire management team or a focus group, kind of a task force, and really tapping their brain power because they know what works for their department or their division. And really as a group talking through, like, what is this going to look like? What's best for our organization? What are employees going to be receptive to? How can we make our work culture even better upon the return? What's worked well remotely that we should keep doing? Like, are people much more efficient? Like, wow, everyone's been saying how they don't miss all the meetings we've had, or that they're getting so much more work done. How do we replicate that? So not just kind of just returning to normal. It's like you keep hearing that, you know, what's the new normal? And so really being thoughtful, getting the managers involved, and then having a communication plan of how do we communicate this to the staff so there is buy-in. So they know our thought process, they know our reasoning, and that it lands well. This is a big time for organizational change. So if you took a, you know, organizational change class in college, this is the time to pull out the notes. This is the time to listen to podcasts on organizational change. Because it's going to be a change going back into the work environment. And so organizations, there's so much good material out there on how do you do a good change and how do you get employee involvement and because people usually don't like change, but if you go about it the right way, they'll embrace it.
Yeah. Everyone, please keep submitting your questions. We're running low on questions here. We're also running towards the end of the session. So any other burning questions you got, please submit them now. I think one other category of question that we got in the first submission form that we haven't touched on yet is kind of the other end of this, bringing back furloughed employees, bringing back laid off staff, and even starting to consider hiring with, you know, social distancing policies in place. Just again, you know, questions and concerns that you should be thinking about when you're getting ready to dial back up your workforce and bring people back, kind of separate from the remote, in person or not, but assuming that you've furloughed your whole arts organization, or school is coming back in the summer, just HR considerations when bringing everybody back?
Yes. I remember one of the questions that someone submitted during the registration process was, what if I offer work and someone refuses because they don't feel safe, or maybe they like the unemployment they're getting and they don't want to come back? What do I do? In that situation, I'd recommend having dialogue with the employee rather than just going back and forth on email, and kind of talking through, like, well, is there anything we could do differently in bringing you back that would make you feel comfortable? Sometimes incentivizing employees. So let's say you're going to bring back employees that provide direct services, because you're going to reopen a program for the public. And so you're only bringing in those employees. Maybe you pay them at a higher rate than they normally get paid, right? It's just temporary. You give them a memo that explains this is temporary for a certain amount of time, and we'll reevaluate. But then it's like, hey, instead of getting $20 an hour, I'm going to get 25 because I'm having to come in with a mask and I don't feel 100% safe. But it's kind of showing that you understand that that's a burden on them, and that you want to reward them for that. And then you might have more employees inclined to be like, yeah, that actually is going to make it worth my while. And then, yeah, if you do have employees that just say they do not want to come back after having dialogue and they still don't want to come back, I would not recommend terminating employees or asking them to resign. I'd recommend putting them on a continued leave of absence. Just anytime you terminate someone, it could set your organization up for a wrongful termination claim. And with emotions and anxieties and whatnot running so high, you just don't want to do that. So I'd say just under these unique situations, it's like you're not going to force people to come back. You're going to incentivize them. You're going to deal with their concerns. And if they don't want to come back, you put them on a leave of absence.
Gotcha. Some good questions popping up, and sorry if there's a lot of background noise. Of course, the gardener showed up like right now. An anonymous person asked about independent contractors. Basically, the pandemic made them realize how heavily they relied on independent contractors as staff for their small nonprofit. Are there concerns around changing their classification going forward? Which had like AB5 alarm bells going off for me. So curious if those would intersect.
Yeah, definitely. That's, the ABC and AB5, like that is not going away. It's kind of it went off the radar because companies are focusing on so many other things, but it's still there. It's a reality. So once we're through all this, that liability is still going to exist. So it is good to have an HR consultant, HR department, or an employment attorney to really look through and say, do these people, do they meet the ABC criteria of being an independent contractor? And the longer you keep someone classified in the incorrect category, the more exposure you have, right? Because someone could claim back wages, that they didn't get meal breaks, rest periods. They could have an injury and say that they should have been employees, so it should be handled under workers' comp. So the sooner that you reclassify, the better. I would say that reclassifying in the midst of this probably isn't the best idea. So I'd get through this to the other side where there's, just people, if all of a sudden they're like being reclassified in the middle of a crisis, they might take exception to that. So they might be more ready for the change and more open to the idea of becoming an employee after we kind of get through this.
Good question from Annette about what kind of guidelines we can expect from the county or the state as far as return to work protocols, like wearing masks, social distancing, et cetera. And, having staff sign agreements every day that they're coming in symptom-free, and just how much of that guidance is going to be external versus needing to figure it out, business by business, organization by organization.
I think a lot of it will be external. It's just tricky because you just don't go to one external resource. You have to figure out like, okay, our nonprofit is in the United States. What is the US saying? We're in this county, we're in this city. And so you really have to look at all the guidance that's being provided on all of those and try to figure out how all those interplay and which ones, what you need to follow, and then come up with a protocol. And really, this is where employee safety comes in. Anytime that there's hazards in the workplace, Cal OSHA requires that an employer evaluates those hazards and how you can do the job safely, and that they train employees on how to do the job safely. And if there is no documentation on that, Cal OSHA assumes that that training didn't happen. So it would really be good to have a training, via Zoom before people come back into the workplace, have a safety expert do a training, and then have a document that everyone signs. Maybe do it via DocuSign, that lays out, like, this is how our organization is going to keep safe as we return. So, we no more than this number of people in the break room at this time. We now have these you should try to wash your hands or sanitize your hands at least 4 times a day. There are posters that you can put up in the workplace about, following certain guidelines, but you lay out all those things and how you're going to make it a safe environment. And then you want to document that, so that an employee couldn't come back and say they didn't know how to be safe in the environment.
Yeah. I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm curious if I'm right. Can you reduce the hours of a full-time person's job, and can they also apply for unemployment insurance at the same time? Or is it one or the other? You got to furlough them for them to be able to apply for unemployment?
Great question. If there's any reduction in compensation, an employee can file for unemployment to make up the difference.
Awesome. We had talked a little bit ago about reimbursement for mileage and out-of-pocket expenses and stuff. Curious if you've got any best practices or templates for things more like, home office, internet, cell phone usage kind of things that don't fall in that traditional, mileage and expense kind of calculation.
Yeah, so mileage is easy because you just go with the IRS reimbursement or the charitable organization reimbursement if you can't afford the IRS. But there's really no law that says you have to reimburse this amount for internet, if someone uses their home internet, if they use their personal computer, or if they use their cell phone. So what we look at is case law. And what I've heard from employment attorneys that right now, what is considered a reasonable reimbursement is around $30 for a laptop, around $20 for a cell phone, and around $20, $20 for a home internet. And so you could do detailed calculations on, like what's the usage and all of that. But it's just easier to kind of give a flat dollar amount reimbursement. And if you do something that is reasonable and somewhere in those parameters, if you're just giving $2 reimbursement for a cell phone, and most people's cell bills are, $100 a month, that would probably, people would scratch their heads like, that's, I'm on my phone a lot more than that for work, and that just doesn't make sense. So you just kind of do what's reasonable in those cases, and just have people follow the normal protocol, give them a deadline, that you need to request reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses by this deadline. Some organizations, in this environment, they're just generating the reimbursements automatically. Employees don't have to request it, so that it's just turnkey because they know the employees are utilizing all these things.
Gotcha. Well, we're just about at the end, a few minutes left. Curious, Regina, any other questions to throw to Clark? Anything that you thought was going to come up that we didn't discuss yet?
I think just as everybody's trying to adjust, if an employee wanted to take a leave of absence while they're settling whatever, is that an unpaid leave? If, we're all trying to be flexible here and keep our doors open?
Yes, yeah, that would typically be unpaid. And so you just always want to ask, now is a good time for HR or someone who can keep it confidential on what is the reason for your leave, because there are some things that trigger the sick pay through the Families First Act, and we don't want to not pay that. So it is good to ask employees, confidentially, is the reason related to your leave? based on the Families First flyer. And if you in an organization have not sent that out to your employees yet, you do want to send that out. That is a required document that any employer with under 500 employees needs to send in. It shows all the reasons for the leave. But yeah, if it's something unrelated to COVID, that would just be non-paid. And then during this time, employees really we need to give them the flexibility to choose what they want to tap. Do they want to tap Families First leave if it's related to that? Maybe they don't want to tap that. They want to tap their vacation balance. So they can tap their time off balances during this time. And the government said we need to give them flexibility to, unless it doesn't fall within your policy guidelines. So if an employee said, I just want to take time off and just relax and go on vacation, and I want to use my sick pay for it, your sick pay policy says that's not a reason. So they couldn't use sick time, but they could use vacation.
Well, it definitely sounds like we should have more conversations in the next few weeks about good practices for bringing people back. Most likely there's going to be more questions about how to let people go and how to deal with change. I think I'm just really grateful, Clark, that you were willing to, that we covered a lot of waterfront today in this conversation. I think real valuable to people to get your perspective and candid advice, and where we don't know the answers yet, we'll just keep trying, right? Because It's all changing. But really appreciate you being willing, and really grateful to the many, many, many of you that have been on the line this afternoon. And we do have a lawyer tomorrow available at lunchtime for our working lunch session. You guys can always find Clark at Expert Effect with his team, and we're here to answer your questions about how to operate in this environment. We are, because some people are starting to look at the months ahead and how to be best informed on HR, on operations, on the legal. We decided to bring in somebody tomorrow to just think about what to start to consider if you're working with your board and considering scenarios and options. So that's tomorrow, and then we'll be back with other sessions next week as you guys all tell us what you need. So thank you all, and thank you, Clark, and thank you, Aaron, as always, for making this look easy. and we'll see you all soon.
Awesome.
Right.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Fun. You're welcome. Bye.
Bye-bye.